So welcome everyone. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Ali Griffin. I'm the Chief Executive here at London Councils. I'm really pleased that you could join one of our London in Brief events on the recent findings from our annual survey of Londoners and what's important to them and what's impacting them as Londoners, and really pleased to introduce Lewis Hill in a moment from Ipsos Mori, who conducted the research on our behalf and will take us through the detail. The way this session is going to work is, as I said, we'll hear from Lewis, give us, I think, a lot of food for thought, and no doubt you'll want to think about whether these findings resonate with what you're hearing on the ground from your residents and businesses. I suspect there'll be some difference as well as some resonance, and we could perhaps explore that through the Q&A. In this Teams session, you'll notice in the top bar, normally when you get into the chat and that sort of stuff, there's a Q&A specific icon. If you do have any questions that are arising either through the presentation or at the end, I'll invite you again. Please do post them in the Q&A section, and then we'll be able to field those at the end of the presentation. I also will invite people to raise their hand in the normal way to get things going. So without further ado, I think I've covered all of the housekeeping that we need to. It's a really interesting set of results, and I'm looking forward to exploring them with you. But Lewis, first, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ali, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for joining. Thank you for inviting me to present findings from the survey of Londoners for London Councils today. So as Ali mentioned, I'm Lewis Hill. I'm a research director at Ipsos. I'm joined by my colleague Laurie, who's lurking in the background. She's going to help answer any tricky questions that you might have a bit later. I'm going to spend no more than around 20 minutes or so talking through some of the key findings from the most recent survey of Londoners, which we were commissioned to run sort of towards the end of last year. But just before I start, and I guess by way of a quick overview of the survey and what it is, we spoke with just over 1,000 Londoners aged 18 and above. We did that through an online survey between the 27th of October and the 9th of November last year. And we set quotas and we weighted the data to make sure that our sample was and is representative of Londoners more widely. And we've run this sort of survey a few times for London councils over the years, and you'll see that we have some trend data in different places. So on to the next slide. And before we get into this year's sort of London Council survey data, I think it's worth taking a little bit of a step back and just reminding ourselves of the, I mean, it has to be said, pretty grim backdrop when we spoke with Londoners towards the end of last year. And as we start 2023, I can't pretend that working in public opinion is particularly fun at the moment. Things feel pretty bleak as we're pushing from crisis to crisis and asking the public what they think about it. But I think fair to say there is something of an optimism recession among the public in the UK. London's no different in that regard. As you can see here, nationally, around the time that we were conducting this survey of Londoners, the British public overwhelmingly felt that we as a country are heading in the wrong direction. Just 9% of people think we're heading in the right direction. We know from more recent work, around 9 in 10 of the British public expect the state of the British economy even to get worse in the next 12 months. So as we move on to the next slide, it's really against this backdrop that we kind of see the rising cost of living overwhelmingly coming out as the biggest issue that Londoners feel the capital faces today. In fact, at 77%, this is the highest level we've ever recorded for cost of living as a key concern in any London Council survey before. But as well as the cost of living, people tell us that housing affordability and the lack of housing are also big issues facing the capital. Crime and policing, the NHS and GP services making up the top 5 issues facing London, according to Londoners. And unfortunately, we're starting now to see the effects of the rising cost of living on Londoners. And as the next slide will show in just a second, around 1 in 4 Londoners telling us that they're finding it difficult to manage financially these days. That figure's higher for women. It's higher for renters, who are far more likely to say that they're struggling. Those from minority ethnic background, and those from lower socioeconomic groups also disproportionately feeling the financial strain from the cost of living crisis. And on the next slide, really worryingly, I think the survey also tells us that some Londoners are having to act, and in some cases, quite sort of drastic action, really, to help with the rising cost of living. So, as you can see here, around one quarter or so, just under, said that they're using savings to get by. 1 in 5 say they've seen a reduction in their household income. And as you kind of go down the list, while the proportions get smaller for some of the responses, I still think it's pretty significant that lots of Londoners tell us that they're starting to use debt to cover the cost of bills. And actually, I remember seeing some survey data recently. There was a poll that was done. I think it was by us, but suggested that the same groups that I mentioned on the previous slide across Britain, among the most likely to say that they'd really struggle to pay for an unexpected but necessary household expense. So some groups really feeling the pinch, and the rising cost of living clearly one of the biggest challenges that councils are facing, that you as councillors are facing across London at the moment. And on to the next slide. One of the obvious questions this raises is, well, what will people do? Where will people look for help? How are they going to try and deal with some of these effects? So we're really interested to see, I suppose, kind of the extent to which people would feel comfortable seeking help from you as councils and various other potential sources. And what you can see here is that while most people said that they would be, or people are more likely to say they'd feel comfortable speaking with a member of their family to ask for help, citizens' advice similarly ranking quite highly. Comparatively few say they would feel comfortable speaking to councils. Now, this is especially true for private renters. So just 1/3 of private renters across the capital say that they would feel comfortable asking their local council for support. And as we know from that earlier slide, private renters among those more likely to say that they're struggling financially too. So it may well be the case that many private renters have less access to some certain avenues and channels for support. So I think they're possibly a group worth keeping an eye on as the cost of living crisis progresses. Next slide, please. And of course, we know renters in London have faced some pretty big housing challenges in the capital this past year, particularly around cost, of course, also availability. This year's survey finds that 3 in 5 renters say their rental amount was increased in the past year. There's concern among many that there are more rent rises to come as well. A sense perhaps that some may have to move out, possibly even out of London, if their monthly amount increases further. At least that's what they say. Though we know from another question we posed in the survey that Londoners are no more likely to say that they expect to do that in the coming years than they have in previous years. So I'm not suggesting there's kind of an imminent danger of kind of a mass exodus, but certainly it's something that renters in particular are nervous about. So across capital, people facing big financial challenges at the moment. Survey has an awful lot more detail on this, which is well worth looking into at your leisure. So far, so doom and gloom. But I think on a more optimistic note, most Londoners remain satisfied with their local area as a place to live. So around 2/3, as you can see here, saying they're satisfied with the local area, compared with just 15% who are not. Again, those figures very consistent with what we saw the year before in 2021 survey. As you can see on the slide, though, there is some variation. So the youngest and oldest Londoners are typically more positive about the local area. Likewise, owner-occupiers, people who are in their homes, those living in inner London, slightly more likely to say that they're satisfied too. And it's also pleasing on the next slide to see a slight increase in the extent to which Londoners feel they belong to their local area. Again, similar proportion, around 2/3 there who feel a strong sense of belonging, compared with 1/3 who perhaps feel that less strongly. And I think what's nice to see is that Londoners are feeling that sense of belonging more now than perhaps they did sort of a year before, maybe when the pandemic was kind of more top of mind and people were possibly feeling a bit more in a state of flux at that time. As for satisfaction with local councils in London, sure, lots of interest in this next slide. Well, I think that's held up very well through the pandemic too, I'd say. And last year we saw an increase in the proportion of people who said that they were satisfied with the way their local council runs things. That proportion's remained largely constant and consistent in the most recent survey. So I think, despite the financial pressures, huge challenges that many people, many Londoners are facing in their day-to-day lives, it remains the case that people are more likely to be satisfied with their council than dissatisfied. And I think that's definitely another positive that we can take from the survey. We're always interested in engaging Londoners' views about devolution. Obviously, sort of a big question about local power transfer. And on the next slide, for what we'll see, I mean, and it actually is worth saying, this is something that we've covered for multiple waves of the survey now. And again, remarkable consistency, kind of attitudes towards power transfer remain fairly predictable and consistent over that time, albeit perhaps a slight increase in the number of people who are opposed. But broadly speaking, people more likely to support than oppose the idea of there being more kind of local power making potential. On the next slide, though, and what's really interesting, I think, is and this is a new question that we posed for the 2022 survey, when you frame transferring more powers around particular policy areas, especially housing and public transport, as you can see at the top here, you see a lot more Londoners supporting the transfer of those powers in those particular areas. So, I wonder whether Londoners may be more open to the idea of councils having a greater ability to deal with some of the issues that they see the capital currently facing, and trusting councils to do that. The next slide, we also something else that we've sort of tracked over time is attitudes towards policies designed to improve environmental outcomes. Obviously, that imperative incredibly big across local and national policy. And one of the things that we saw during the pandemic was quite a big jump in support for some of these policies, perhaps as people spent less time out and about during the pandemic. There's been a little bit of a rebound, I'd say, in the survey, the most recent surveys. People are returning to roads and public transport in greater numbers. And I think you can sort of see like levels of support broadly in sort of a settled state now. I mean, support typically higher for things like more funding for active travel infrastructure. Gets a lot weaker when you look at sort of more stringent measures, things like universal road charging, low traffic neighbourhoods, which I'm sure are very topical. But I just want to place some of these findings in context. And on the next slide, I've got some data from a national survey that we ran last year. And this was kind of a separate survey. It was all about understanding policies to combat net zero, combat net zero, combat net zero, you know what I mean, achieve net zero rather. And we're kind of really interested to look at the variation between kind of in principle support and then, kind of what some of the implications of that might be. So as you can see here, while in principle support is quite high for many of these things, so frequent flyer levies, EV subsidies, even low traffic neighbourhoods, 53% there. When you start talking about increasing taxes to fund some of these interventions, support can drop, well, as you can see here, quite dramatically in some cases. So I think the point I'm trying to make here really is, this isn't a straightforward picture where the environment is concerned, and you guys are all the experts. Local attitudes we know vary significantly depending on the local context too. This is obviously a kind of London-wide picture, but I think interesting nonetheless. The next slide, please. And we know that many Londoners think crime and antisocial behaviour is an issue facing the capital. We saw that earlier. As you can see here, many do indeed continue to be worried about being a victim of various different crimes. And when we completed the 2021 survey, so year before last, that survey field work took place fairly shortly after the tragic murder of Sarah Everard, and there'd been sort of a series of other violent attacks in the press. And at that time, we saw quite a big jump in the concern around a whole range of crimes, but particularly some of those more violent crimes. When we spoke rather with Londoners again this time around, while some of that concern does remain, clearly, as we can see here, there have been some falls in the proportion of people who say that they're worried about these types of crimes. So I think it's good, I suppose, to see things moving in the right direction in that respect, but clearly lots of concern still about. This year, for the first time, onto the next slide, we asked Londoners a little bit about their experiences of domestic abuse, and their thoughts about how and whether people who experience it, if people think that they would be able to access the right support. And I think this has produced one of the more stark figures for this year's survey. So 1 in 4 Londoners tell us that they have personal experience of domestic abuse, whether that's personally themselves or through someone that they know. There is more detail on sort of attitudes for the support that people who are affected might be able to access. Very broadly speaking, Londoners they're more confident than not that people who seek support would be able to get it, but many disagree, and women are more likely to disagree. So I think a lot of really important data there from that question. Next slide, please. You obviously don't need me to tell you that the NHS and healthcare services are facing pretty unprecedented pressures, challenges at the moment. A reminder that we spoke to Londoners, I think probably about 3 months or so ago now, when the fieldwork took place. Of course, remains to be seen how experiences will change over the course of this year, and clearly things are moving quite negatively quite quickly. But Londoners who had access to health service in the 12 months before taking part in the survey, generally speaking, were pretty positive about their experiences across a range of different services, and especially private healthcare too. But right across the board, particularly looking at the tops of sexual health clinics, some private healthcare, access women's healthcare, and that kind of thing. But of course, we know the crisis is developing, and as the next slide shows, Londoners tend to think the biggest problems that health services in London are facing relate to difficulties accessing treatment, to long waiting times, staffing levels, and this is sort of third place there, slow referrals between services. Those kind of make up the top three issues. Those are the things that Londoners seem to be worried about from a sort of a health provision perspective. Another new area of the survey this year was asylum seekers. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was probably about this time last year, wasn't it, or February last year. I think that's really brought the experiences of asylum seekers and refugees into sharper relief, and many Londoners agree that more funding should be made available by government to London boroughs, to help asylum seekers and refugees find housing, jobs and education. We also know from the survey that many Londoners have also taken action themselves to support asylum seekers and refugees, most commonly things like donating money to charities or goods to the cause. I think 22% said that they'd done that, 16% said they'd been in contact with a government official, written a letter or signed a petition or something like that, though most Londoners said they hadn't done any of the actions that we listed out. And on the next slide, another new area we wanted to explore and just wanted to sort of touch on briefly in the presentation was equality in the capital. So we're really sort of seeking to understand whether or not Londoners feel London offers equal access to the same opportunities for all, regardless of people's background. And as you can see here, while many do feel that Londoners do have equal access, regardless of gender, in particular, sexual orientation, religion, London is perhaps a bit more split where race, social class, and disability are concerned. So possibly a little bit of a sense from the survey this year that Londoners don't all agree that the capital necessarily offers equal opportunities for all. So what do Londoners think about the future? Onto the next slide. Well, I think it's fair to say Londoners are resilient. Londoners are pretty bullish about our ability to bounce back from the cost of living crisis. So we have around half of Londoners who think, yes, we will bounce back. But on a more challenging note, we're much more likely to agree than disagree that the economy will become weaker over the next 5 years in London. And I think quite a bit of scepticism around the ability of public services to improve in the capital over the next 5 years too. So possibly some lingering concerns there. And then finally, for me, I guess this is sort of important but kind of quite topical and interesting finding. But we also asked a bit about hybrid work. So among those who told us from the survey that they are in work, I think a real sense that hybrid working is here to stay, actually, kind of this year and beyond. It seems like comparing Londoners' current working patterns and their anticipated patterns over the next 12 months, the Londoners, for the most part, have sort of broadly settled into their post-pandemic working habits. So as you can see here, a significant proportion of Londoners having a hybrid work routine. Many, of course, though, still needing to travel into their place of work all of the time, and a much smaller proportion saying that they will work from home all of the time. So that's sort of a bit of a whistle stop tour, a bit of brief overview, trying to squeeze it all into 20 minutes or so. I guess just to summarize, I mean, really, cost of living it's the key story this year. We saw it emerging, and in fact, credit to London councils actually. We saw it emerging as early as 2018. That kind of steady uplift in terms of concern around it, but it really, really dominates now. And as we saw, some Londoners are struggling financially, and I suppose particularly concerning to you and to all of us, some starting to take quite risky steps to cope. So many, and I think one of the kind of things that kind of really stuck out to me was that finding around private renters and many others saying that they'd be uncomfortable asking you for help. And I just wonder, is that something that needs tackling? How can you tackle that perception and stop people, especially private renters, falling through the cracks? And of course, against a backdrop of renters really navigating a lot of housing challenges, obviously incredibly complex, not easily fixed, but nonetheless, that's something that kind of really comes out through the survey. But I don't want to be all doom and gloom. Despite the challenges, people remain satisfied with their local area. It was great to see that sense of belonging kind of coming back post-pandemic, and satisfaction with the councils. You know, as we said, we had that pre-pandemic measure. We have that measure from 3 months ago, really holding up well, I think, through the pandemic, and great to see it kind of make it through the pandemic intact too. Support for devolution has remained steady for many years now. In principle, support does appear to increase for specific policy areas, particularly transport and housing. And then, as I sort of said, a couple of things towards the end. Not necessarily all Londoners who agree that the capital offers equal opportunities, particularly by some of those groups. And while we tend to feel the capital will recover from the cost of living crisis, we're always very resilient, very bullish, but real concerns about the future of the economy and the impact on public services too. So that's, I think that's it from me for now. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening. Happy to take any questions you might have, and I think it's back to you, Ali. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Lewis. So an awful lot of information there, and Councillor Masters rightly asked the first question really in the Q&A about will we be making the presentation available. So apologies, I should have said that at the start. Yes, we'll be circulating the presentation to all of you, but also we're doing a recording of this presentation that will be sending you the link, but also will be available on our website, so other councillor colleagues will be able to benefit from this insight too at a later date. So I wondered whether there were any initial questions or reflections colleagues have. So I'm gonna just, somebody raised their hand, so let's see who that is, and I don't want it to be me. Hang on a minute. Did I see a hand go up and then it? No. Oh, so yes, Councillor Masters. Somebody's just about to unmute you and then speak.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's also depressing, and depressing also that obviously what you've presented is already to some extent out of date. I heard a news report this morning about the level of nervousness for homeowners about being able to pay mortgages, and that hasn't really been touched on in your findings, which are very much skewed towards renters. My question really is, I mean, it's a perfect storm for councillors, because whereas you perhaps would be more sort of experienced in looking at low-income Londoners, what's difficult is perhaps having the onslaught of middle class or 2 years ago fairly well off people now suddenly having really awful headwinds. So are you looking at that? Have you got any evidence of that? And yes, and I would imagine that in terms of reluctance to speak to councils, that kind of group would be even worse. So yeah, just to get your feedback on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question and a great observation. And yeah, apologies for the skew to renters. I promise it's not because I'm a renter myself. But you're absolutely right. It is a perfect storm. Most by most sort of measures, the kind of the crisis really hasn't started to affect a lot of homeowners yet, because of course fixed rates are baked in, and you look at sort of some of the figures as those fixed rates end, and this year is when you really start to see, well, Londoners, but of course people across the country in pretty big numbers starting to see pretty dramatic uplifts in their housing payments. It's not going to be easy. I really don't envy you as councillors having to navigate that, perhaps having interactions with people who you might not otherwise necessarily need to kind of support, and that is going to be difficult. I mean, notwithstanding the skew to renters, yes, they are, more likely to say that they're struggling financially now. That's not to say that some owner occupiers aren't struggling financially now either. There are some in the survey too. If we're able to do the survey again later this year, I imagine we'd see a different and more nuanced picture. So yeah, I mean, I'm afraid I don't have any immediate solutions, and possibly not qualified for that. But you're absolutely right. I would imagine, and we do ask nationally questions of this nature to homeowners, and there is a lot of concern, particularly around interest rates. And we had started to see that already towards the end of last year. as many many homeowners were starting to, well, I think, panic about some of the implications of those increases.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lewis. Thanks, Councillor, for your question. I've not seen any other hands raised at the moment, but one of our colleagues has asked a question in the Q&A, Lewis, around, how might councillors be seeing some of those cost of living concerns presented in their day-to-day surgeries, and when they're out and about. Councillor Musters has actually really, as you said, highlighted how quickly this picture is changing as well, and so what might be some of the things that colleagues need to just be mindful of as they're working with their residents.
Yeah, another good question. I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because I suppose part of the challenge is people presenting themselves at all. I mean, if the data as it stands at the moment is borne out, it seems likely that people will try other avenues first. We'll speak to family and friends. It might well be that citizens' advice see, in fact, it wouldn't surprise me at all if they're already starting to see, some pretty hefty uplifts in contacts and that kind of thing. It's a really difficult question to answer. I mean, I suppose, as people are competing for increasingly scant and scarce resources, it's just a question of prioritization and probably having quite difficult conversations with people about some of the challenges that they're facing. I mean, I hesitate to sort of use the survey as a kind of a warning, but I suppose one advantage of kind of understanding that now is knowing, or at least kind of being able to anticipate that might well be a feature in the coming year, and sort of starting to maybe, I mean, one thing that might be sort of might be some joy is sort of looking into better collaboration possibly with citizen advice and other bodies who perhaps are more likely to see some of those people coming forward first. Are there resources that can be shared, that can be kind of pooled, and people kind of pointed in the right direction for the right sorts of support? But clearly it's not going to be easy. I mean, if I had better answers than the one that I'd just given, I probably wouldn't be an opinion poller.
Thanks, Lewis, and to that nod for the work our councillors do too. So, Councillor Adajar, have you got a question for us and for Lewis? We haven't been able to unmute you. Can one of the colleagues unmute the councillor, please?
Ali, they are unmuted. If the councillor can unmute, press the unmute button on their laptop.
That'd be great. Is that possible, councillor? Sarai, can you hear me? She still can't unmute, unfortunately. Maybe if you post the type your question in the Q&A, Sarai, I'm sorry about why you can't unmute, and we'll see if we can go to another question and then we'll come back to you, if that's okay. So just tap on the Q&A icon at the top and we'll hopefully be able to see your question soon. Another question is whether there are any observations specifically about children and young people, and anything especially around, anecdotally, and I think again through the work different councils are doing, definitely seen Did you hear
Ali,
that?
I'm afraid
I think I cut out.
we missed you.
Sorry, Ali.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
you
sorry.
cut out.
There's a question. I'll repeat it. Sorry, everyone. Bit of technical problems there. We're having all round. Was there anything in the survey or that pointed to or picked up around children and young people, their mental health and well-being? Because we're seen as that as a bit of a concern, absolutely significant concern on the ground, and whether any of the research is pointing to that. And if you could say a bit about that, Lewis, that'd be
Yeah,
great.
absolutely. I mean, the survey was of adults aged 18 plus, so didn't speak to any children themselves, but taking families as a proxy, and I'm hoping that Laurie can sort of have a little look at one or two things in the background, and perhaps we can sort of share in the chat or after the session. Know that families are particularly worried about certain things, the cost of living crisis in particular. One of the things, and I'd need to double check this in this data, but certainly noticed it in some of the other work that we've done nationally around the cost of living, is sort of an interesting dynamic whereby you have sort of the youngest, I think I might have mentioned this, the youngest and the oldest resident tending to feel a bit more comfortable, possibly those kind of younger adults having or being afforded a degree of protection by kind of living at home or life stage. And then at sort of 25 to 34 in that age group onwards, kind of seeing a bit more of an uplift in terms of kind of concern around financial resilience and some of those challenges. So that's definitely a feature of the data, I think. But we can have a look in more detail at some of the other measures that might kind of nod towards that. Perhaps sort of the health data as well. But I mean, you're absolutely right. More widely, that is a challenge, particularly post pandemic, and some of the challenges that young people, particularly in sort of later stages of education, faced, and kind of as they're being, I hesitate to say spat out, but kind of as they're kind of graduating and looking to enter the workforce at a time where things aren't particularly easy at the moment. That is a real concern, and in fact may well be a sort of an interesting avenue for future survey work too.
Thank you, Lewis. So I'm just gonna pick up in the chat, I think. So this is from Councillor Adajal, who couldn't technically get off mute, unfortunately, but has written her questions. So for councillors representing boroughs recognised as having high levels of deprivation, she'd be interested in the data with significant numbers feeling that London is a place of inequality in respects of race and class, and whether the data are able to get into that level of detail.
Yeah.
And was this a sentiment represented, across the piece, or are there places where it's expressed more strongly?
Yeah, I mean, I think again we can have a look at this in more detail, but from memory, I think that there's less variation. Well, I suspect it's obviously correlation and causation are kind of different things. But I think there's greater variation in terms of attitudes demographically. So what we tended to find was that people from a minority ethnic background, for example, were more likely to feel inequality. Feel that London, or less likely to agree that London is equal or provides equal opportunities for people regardless of their ethnic minority background. And similarly for some of those other sort of minority groups and other people with different demographic characteristics, less so area based, but of course areas are very demographically diverse, and some boroughs are far more ethnically diverse than others, and that kind of thing too. So we can kind of pull that out a little bit more, but my hunch is that it's sort of an obvious thing to say, but it's less about kind of where you live and more about the kind of your own demographic background as to kind of how you'd feel about that. But that certainly does lead to a degree of variation from area to area. So I think we don't go as low as kind of borough level in terms of our reporting, but we do have an inner and outer split, and I think that dynamic is borne out in terms of in inner London typically being a bit more ethnically diverse, a bit younger, and so perhaps those in the London boroughs sort of likely to less likely to feel that London is equal, though I think that's more a symptom of kind of their experience rather than where they live.
Great, thank you, Lewis. Are there any other questions from colleagues? I can't see any hands or anything in the Q&A. Did you want to say something, Lewis?
Yeah, sorry, just while you're looking, Ali, Laurie's very helpfully pulled out some data in answer to the earlier question around mental health, and has reminded me that we have a really interesting couple of questions which I didn't present and perhaps should have done, around Londoners' self-reported satisfaction with physical and mental health, and what you tend to find there, and again sort of intuitively, but there may be more in this from a sort of particular, if there's a particular angle that you're interested in and we can help with. Older Londoners typically reporting lower satisfaction with their physical health, but much better satisfaction with their mental health. So you kind of have it completely the other way around. So yes, younger Londoners more likely than older Londoners to report being dissatisfied with their mental health at the moment.
Thank you, Lewis, and thanks to Lil for digging out the data. Are there any other questions or observations colleagues wanted to make? Or will we draw to a close? No, everyone's very busy. So one thing I did want to add was just a plug really for the work that Councillor Claire Holland, who is the executive member at London Councils for Communities and also the leader of Lambeth Council, but with a number of other councillor colleagues across the capital, are leading our work on cost of living, because we know at a borough level you're all doing things that are, you know, a tremendous amount of effort to try and support communities and residents and indeed businesses through the cost of living crisis. And what Claire's work is trying to do is make sure that we're learning from each other in a rapid way so that we can provide as comprehensive support to Londoners as possible, but also have the evidence to lobby and influence government and others where we need to, because councils can't possibly do it all. And as we've heard from the survey as well, sometimes it's organisations in the voluntary sector are better placed to have that immediate relationship with residents and how you're supporting them. And we're doing some work with Citizen Advice to ensure that we can share their data so that you're getting really up-to-date information about how the cost of living is impacting on Londoners. So that's a bit of a plug for that work. Of course, the cost of living isn't the only issue that we've touched on today in the presentation, and London councils will continue to work with the executive and the officers, with borough cabinets to ensure that we're focusing on those issues over the next 12 months that are important to Londoners. But thank you for making the time. I know this is our second London in Brief this week, so we are being a bit greedy, I think, with councillors' time, but hopefully you found this useful. And we thank Lewis and all the team at London Councils as well, who have contributed to ensuring that the survey happens and that we've got products that we can use back in our local communities. Thanks, everyone, and look forward to seeing you at one of these very soon.
Thanks, everyone.